Hey folks, it's Nate. It's time I got back to the drawing board, and we're back with the book club. Tonight we're going to talk about Chapter 2 of Hirohiko Araki's Manga in Theory and Practice. This chapter is titled Mastering the Four Major Fundamentals of Manga Structure. Now this part is actually really straightforward. It's almost a second introduction to the book, but not to the purpose of the book, but to the meat of the book. So in this chapter, all Araki really does is he introduces the four major portions of a manga, and he refers to them as characters, story, setting, and themes. Now, if you're someone who's studied writing a lot, if you're a classically trained writer, some of these are going to be familiar and some of these are going to be less familiar. Characters, of course, will stand out to you very quickly. So will themes. Story and setting are different, not typically used in most story writing classes, at least not the ones I took. Setting is kind of understood. It's world building, it's time period, it's things like that. Generally, in the courses I've taken, setting was broken down into slightly smaller categories. But maybe in the courses you've taken, you've heard it called that. Story is, of course, plot. In the Western tradition, it's referred to as the plot, the beats of the story, depending on how you studied writing. So those are the four in order of importance. And while there is kind of a weight to the importance of them, he points out very quickly that they are not separate, they are interconnected. So you can look at them independently and you can emphasize one or another, but they are all interconnected. They're all very important to each other, as well as to the story as a whole. And then he has this actually very fascinating graphic right here where he shows the way everything is kind of tied together. So you have the characters, the story, and the setting, and they are all kind of wrapped up in the larger sphere of themes, and they all rest inside of art, which is what kind of the glue that holds them all together. Art, he kind of makes it clear, is not just the art, although visual art is the most important part of the storytelling, but it's also things like dialogue, it's things like sound effects. If you're familiar with Araki's work, you know he is a huge fan of onomatopoeia. He's used it everywhere, so I'm sure that's part of what he's referring to as well. So, dialogue, things like that contribute to the advancement of the story, but are not quite the story itself. The story plot and being plot again, the structure, the skeleton that everything else hangs on. And so once he's talked a lot about the importance of interconnecting all these things and how difficult that is, he comes to one of his most important theses in this chapter, which is a majority of works that fail to capture the readers have problems with their characters. If you can recognize it when it happens in your manga, you can think of how to correct it. So it is very important, especially in longer, more open-ended stories, which is what manga tends to be, to have very strong characters. It is possible to, of course, do story-driven or even setting-driven stories in manga and in other mediums. But Araki is directly addressing these long, open-form, character-driven series that is typical of publishing in manga, and also, to a very large extent, publishing in American comics. American comics tend to focus on their one iconic hero. They have, Superman, Batman, Captain America, Iron Man, whatever. They focus on this one character, and that's how they really get their story across. So I think, especially if you want to do something like that, his discussion of things like characters is very important. And his thesis here in this chapter is very vital to grasp. So he talks in the next section a little bit about manga that focus very heavily on just one aspect of the four that he lays out. He cites some fairly somewhat obscure manga. I have heard of this is a police box in front of Kameri Park in Katsushika Ward. It's a very long running series. It's kind of well known in Japanese culture. I have read several manga that reference it. I've never actually read any of it myself. So there's that. And he presents these as examples of very character-driven stories. Again, Kochi Kame, or the Police Box manga, is a very long-running series, and it's managed to survive on the strength of its main character, who is very well liked by the Japanese public, apparently. Setting as the core of a manga, he actually offers Akira. Not so much the movie, I think, as the manga, which is very... if you've ever read that, the landscapes in it are truly breathtaking. And the establishment of the world just through the art is very striking. He also cites the manga Mushishi, which is very much just about a world where there are vaguely paranormal small bug-like creatures swarming everywhere. And that's really all the stories just are examining what happens when these bugs are everywhere. So that brings him to his second thesis, though. Manga with one element that drastically stands out from the rest will always be limited in some way. To overcome that limit, the other elements are needed. So while it's possible, he says, to make a manga that focuses very heavily on just one element, he stresses throughout all of this book that it is vitally important to balance them. If you want a long-running series, and again, he is aiming his book primarily at people aiming to do that. Not that there aren't lessons to be drawn here for other people, but he is aiming his book towards people making these long-running stories. He emphasizes balancing character, story, setting, and themes. And I think that's very interesting because I whenever I talk to people who are huge fans of American comics, they're always just talking about the characters. They are talking about Batman, or they talk about Superman. They almost never talk about specific stories. If they do, they only cite one or two. And I think that the extent to which American comic books have become skewed entirely towards characters is one of the things that has contributed to how unhealthy they've become. The inability to create new characters because the old ones have eaten up so much of the consciousness, I think, is one of the things that has kept them unhealthy for so long. Anyways, moving on. Make a habit of analyzing bestsellers, not only when you are reading manga, but when you are reading novels or watching movies as well. Instead of just thinking, oh, this is interesting, you should instead analyze why it is interesting, especially with regard to the four fundamentals. And I think this is something that detractors of harsh reviewing miss. You really need to dig into why things work. You can't just say it's a kid's story or it's just a comic book. You have to look at why you like something or you don't like something and really dig into it. What didn't work, what did work, or else you are never going to be able to make something that good yourself because you don't know why it was good. And there are a lot of people, even a lot of people who want to make stories who are unwilling to dig into stuff for whatever reason, and they come up short when they make stories. So I totally agree with this advice. Always dig into things, always try and figure out why they work. I have to admit, when it comes to visual art, I am not as good as I should be at analyzing for what I really like about a piece of art. I just kind of look at it and I think, oh, that's so great, and then I immediately sit down and I try and copy it, or I try and make something like that, and I don't analyze it. That's a weakness of my art that I really need to overcome. So, and that's been true for a long time, but I didn't really think about it till I read this book. So even if you're just struggling as an artist, I think there's advice in here that is really good for you. Anyways, one final thing he says is there may be some works that are out there that are more popular than you feel they deserve to be. I suggest you hold these up against the four fundamental elements. If you do, you may recognize that, for example, the characters in the story are lacking, but the setting is superb. And that must be what has struck a chord with the audience. I think that's an interesting way to analyze something that you don't like, but which is broadly popular. And this is the case with, just to give an example out of my experience, Guardians of the Galaxy, the movies, as opposed to the comics. I've never read any of the comics. Nothing in Guardians of the Galaxy really resonated with me. I mean, it has some good writing, it has some bad writing, but the characters are just kind of blah. The story just kind of blah. But the setting doesn't really appeal to me. But I think the setting really does appeal to a lot of people. It has that retro look. It's very bright. It's very chromium. It's very kind of fun and slacker party-ish. That doesn't really appeal to me, but clearly it does appeal to a lot of people. And again, this is an element of analysis that I think I would not have done if I hadn't read this book, because I have dissected the Guardians of the Galaxy movies in a lot of different ways. But I'm a story guy primarily and a character guy secondarily. I don't tend to dissect settings like I do characters and stories. I like building them, and I tend to be very methodical when I'm building them, but I've never really broken them down granularly and analyzed them. And I wouldn't have thought about it, again, until I read this book. And I've been writing stories since I was like 7, and I've been writing with the benefit of education and training towards professional writing for 15 years. So, yeah, this has really changed my thought processes in some ways. And, just this really short chapter, it's what? 41, it's 5 pages. It's not very long, and yet there's a lot of really good, strong ideas packed in here to really chew over. Some of these other chapters are longer, so as we continue forward, it will not all the videos will be this short, I think, but there's so much here just to challenge you and the way you think in this short chapter. Really great stuff. Again, I can't recommend it enough. If you have read this book, let me know what you thought when you were reading chapter 2. And if you haven't, well, it's certainly worth looking at. If drawing comics or even making movies or writing a novel is your cup of tea. So that's all I got for today. There's a like button and subscribe button down below. Let me know what you think in the comments, and I'll talk to you later.